Today, I'm going to be going over some Grimdark must-reads. Now, the Grimdark genre is a genre that basically stands at the crossroads of fantasy and realism. It's characterized by its grim settings, its morally gray characters, and its pervasive sense of bleakness. It's often examining the human condition and usually going in depth into its characters to make them feel realistic. These are characters that are usually deeply flawed. And overall, Grimdark can offer a departure from the more sanitized, traditional good versus evil fantasy. It's more realistic, with its characters existing within the blurred lines in between. Personally, I've come to realize over the last couple years that Grimdark fantasy is one of my favorite genres of all time. Today, I'm going to be recommending some of the best Grimdark fantasy books out there, and obviously I can't mention them all in one video, so I'm probably going to miss a lot of great ones. Make sure to leave recommendations in the comments because I want to explore more of these books as well, but I hope you'll find some recommendations. Now, before I get into it, real quick, Grimdark is all about realistic characters, and as I've been focusing more on my own writing, I decided to take a class on Storytelling 101 by Daniel Jose Older. The class really focused on building conflict in your character's life, because without conflict, you don't have much of a story. And I found this class on Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry pros across film, illustration, design, music, productivity, and beyond. And in the new year, why not invest in yourself and your goals and try to level up your skills with Skillshare? And if you're not sure where to start, Skillshare has designed learning paths, which will help you go from novice to pro in no time. And these are hand-picked classes that are meant to be taken in order. They build upon each other. I'm currently taking the learning path on how to develop memorable fictional characters. They're available in a range of levels from beginner to advanced and cover a wide variety of categories like productivity, creative freelancing, software like Procreate, and so much more. Now, I encourage you to level up your creative passion and improve your skills with Skillshare in 2024, and the first 500 of you to use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial so you can get started today. Huge thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Moving on to recommending some of the best Grimdark fantasy series ever. Now, I first want to highlight some indie books that I actually haven't had the chance to read yet, but they seem very promising and they're high up on my list. I'm gonna mention these three very quick. First off, there's Kings of Paradise by Richard Nell. Now, this one sounds like it's a coming-of-age anti-hero story that's inspired by Southeast Asian culture. I've heard some really great reviews from friends of mine, so I'm excited to get to it. Next, there is The Gunmetal Gods by Zamil Akhtar, and this sounds like it's a combination of like Lovecraftian gods and the Crusades. It sounds awesome and like very action heavy with rich mythology. And then 11th Cycle by Caine and Ardalan. This is book 1 in the Mistland series. Now, I have heard this one has heavy Dark Souls vibes, and that alone has me highly interested in reading this one. So I plan on reading all 3 of these this year. Okay, with those 3 highlights out of the way, moving on to some more recommendations. The Black Company books by Glenn Cook. These were basically essential in forming the Grimdark genre. They've been massively influential, but I don't actually see many people talking about the Black Company, which is a shame. These books are really gripping, and they really focus on like the horrors of war and showing what the life of a soldier is like in very realistic detail. It tells the story of an elite mercenary unit embroiled in an ancient ongoing war. And Cook's narrative is groundbreaking in how it portrays warfare and the moral complexities of its characters. And of course, being Grimdark, it stands out for its gritty realism and how the lines between good and evil are not just blurred, but often irrelevant to the character's survival and ambitions. Through the eyes of Croker, the company's physician and chronicler, we're offered a really stark and unromanticized look at the life of a soldier and the realities of power. The Black Company is fantastic. It's not talked about enough, actually, and that's my fault as well. I need to talk about these books more. Anyways, I would highly recommend it if you're a fan of Grimdark. Now, when you think of Grimdark, there's a good chance that the first series that comes to mind is A Song of Ice and Fire. George R.R. Martin's magnum opus is a towering example of this subgenre. It weaves together the fates of families and nations in a struggle for the Iron Throne. Martin is not afraid to make a favorite character drop dead. And I mean, A Song of Ice and Fire thrives on its characters' moral complexity. These characters are deeply flawed, making decisions that are often driven by survival, power, or revenge, rather than clear-cut notions of good and evil. And Martin manages to masterfully depict the brutal realities of medieval politics and the lengths individuals and factions will go to gain or maintain power. It's also a series that really focuses on identity. Is Jaime really just the Kingslayer, someone with great skill and purpose but no honor? Or is he Jaime Goldenhand, who tries to do right in a world torn apart? Or is he someone who's willing to do whatever is necessary to get what needs to be done? We see hints of all of these and how they clash with how he identifies himself and how the world identifies him. Don't even get me started on Arya. She has a ton of identities that she's struggling with. Little sister tired of being upstaged, or rogue tomboy. Even Tyrion constantly has to rectify himself against his impish nature. And of course, even Mother of Dragons is a contradiction. Mothers are nurturing, loving, and kind, while dragons are destructive and dangerous. Each character deals with different aspects of their personalities, and I feel like this is such a strong point of A Song of Ice and Fire. Next is The Prince of Thorns. This is the first book in the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence. This has been on my TBR for a long time now, and I finally just got to it recently. Now, this book introduces us to Jorg Ancrath, a young prince with a very dark past. At the age of 9, he witnessed the brutal murder of his mother and younger brother, a traumatic event that basically changed his entire life. At the age of 14, he's now become the Prince of Thorns, the leader of a band of ruthless outlaws. And this is a world that is completely in chaos. There's nightmares and violence everywhere. Jorg is an anti-hero driven by revenge and a fierce desire to reclaim his rightful place as the ruler of his kingdom. And when I say he's an anti-hero, I am not kidding. This is not for the faint of heart. I mean, Lawrence has crafted this really harsh and unforgiving world that mirrors the protagonist's own ruthless nature. I mean, at times, it was actually kind of hard to read because it's very dark. I mean, Jorg commits some terrible actions, but as everything starts to get pieced together, I ended up finding myself actually rooting for him. If you want to read a book about a hero who's also like a major villain, then the Broken Empire trilogy has you covered. Now, there's also the Red Queen's War, which is like a sequel series taking place in the same world. I haven't gotten to that one yet, but I do want to. And also, Mark Lawrence has another highly praised Grimdark series that I just haven't read yet, Book of the Ancestor, which basically involves a school where young women are trained to be assassins. Now, I've heard the protagonist, Nona Gray, is like a really great complex character, and I've heard a lot of great praise for these books, so they deserve a mention. Now, if you happen to be a manga reader, then obviously I'm going to recommend Berserk by Kentaro Miura. It really can't get much darker than Berserk. This is a grimdark epic that, honestly, even if you've never read manga, you should give this series a read if you're a fan of Grimdark. Though I do want to say, if you find that you dislike the series at the beginning, maybe you find the main character comes off a little too edgy, I would recommend to push through until you reach the Golden Age arc, which gives us an extended flashback that reveals his backstory. And after that, it's really hard to not sympathize with Guts, because pretty much everything that's bad happens to him, and I feel for his character a lot, and I understand why he's the way he is. The Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. You guys have recommended this series to me for a long time, and I finally just started it recently. I'm in the middle of reading Malice right now, and so far the pacing seems a little bit slower to me than I was expecting, though it doesn't feel like there's any filler in it at all. And I've been told that the series picks up and the rest of it is pretty much non-stop action and conflict. Now, book 1 takes place in the Banished Lands, where in ancient history, the God War broke the world. Now, a prophecy was foretold that this war is coming back, and people need to unite on both sides to fight it. Now, that is a very simple synopsis, but I don't want to spoil anything. I just want to give my thoughts so far. John Gwynne is amazing at writing action. Like, he's at the same level as Joe Abercrombie, maybe even better when it comes to fight scenes than Abercrombie. And something I just have to give Gwynne like a standing ovation for is how he writes love between family and friends. His characters are much more lovable than Abercrombie's, maybe not quite as interesting, but the characters here are courageous and loyal and just very likable. I've also noticed he uses a lot of familiar tropes, but still manages to make them feel fresh and new, and the world building so far is just so interesting. I love how we're constantly learning more about the Banished Lands. I got a feeling I'm likely going to fly through this series, so as soon as I do, I'll make sure to put up some videos for it. And I should also mention there is the Bloodsworn Saga, starting with the Shadow of the Gods, which is another Grimdark series by John Gwynne, which I plan on starting afterwards. R.F. Kuang's The Poppy War. This merges grimdark fantasy with historical military fiction, and it draws inspiration from the mid-20th century China, and it follows a young woman named Rin, a war orphan who descends from poverty to enroll in an elite military school, only to find herself an unlikely hero in a war with godly powers at play. Now, this one's pretty interesting because it's not actually grimdark for most of the book, but then once like the action hits and war is going on, Kuang does not shy away from showing us the horrors of war, including genocide and drug abuse. Now, I'm actually in the middle of reading the second book, so I'm just gonna recommend the first one as of yet, but I found it to be really compelling. Rin is sort of an unlikable character that makes a lot of bad decisions, but at the same time, I kind of like this direction that the author is putting her in, and it's a book that really challenges the reader to reflect on the cost of greatness and power, and also just to reflect on war and the dehumanization of one's enemies. It's a book about military strategy, collapsing empires, mad gods, and the human ability to make awful, ruthless decisions. Then we have The Axe of Caine by Matthew Stover, book 1 being Heroes Die. The plot for this series is so unique. It is set on a future dystopian Earth where they discover a parallel world called Overworld, which is kind of like a post-Tolkien planet, and the corporations that run Earth send actors into Overworld to carry out adventures in order to provide the masses of the overcrowded Earth with virtual reality entertainment. We follow one of these actors, Harry, who on Overworld is known as Caine, an assassin, and the violence within the Axe of Caine is often portrayed in graphic, gritty detail because that's what the viewers on Earth are seeking. This series pulls no punches, the combat is visceral, and in a lot of ways, this series is an examination of humans' obsession with violence for entertainment. Harry, or Caine, is just so incredibly well written. Stover has crafted some amazing characters, and being first published in 1998, this was well ahead of its time, and it still holds up so well. The Coldfire Trilogy by C.S. Friedman, starting with book 1, Black Sun Rising, first published in 1991. This is a relatively obscure series, and it's one that really should be talked about a lot more. The atmosphere here is very dark and brooding, and I would argue it could be considered grimdark. we're introduced to the world of Urna, a planet where the natural forces known as the Fae respond to human thoughts and fears, often giving life to creatures straight out of nightmares. Basically, all the malevolent creatures of this world are closely tied to the psyche of its human inhabitants, meaning that fear itself is going to result in even more monstrosities. We mostly experience the story through the eyes of Damien Vrice, a priest of a fading earth-based religion, as he forms an uneasy alliance with this anti-hero vampire-like being, Gerald Tarrant, in order to combat a rising evil. Now, the dynamic between Damien and Tarrant is so fascinating because they are polar opposites and at odds in basically everything. In ideology, principles, and abilities, they're completely different. Honestly, it's their dynamic that's like a highlight of the series to me. Now, Friedman masterfully blends elements of fantasy, science fiction, and horror all together with this beautiful writing style that just sweeps you away to Urna and keeps you immersed. I will say the pacing at times can slow down to a slog as they're making their way through these dreary landscapes, but it's balanced out by some truly like mind-blowing scenes. Let me know if you want to see a full video on this series. Now, one of the first examples of Grimdark can be attributed to Michael Moorcock's Elric saga, starting with Elric of Melniboné, which introduces us to one of the most iconic anti-heroes in fantasy. Elric, the sickly albino emperor of the decaying island nation of Melniboné, is a character that's fraught with internal and external conflict throughout the entire story. His reliance on the soul-devouring sword Stormbringer for strength and vitality sets the stage for a tragic narrative that explores a lot of deep themes of fate, power, and the cost of ambition. Now, with this series, Moorcock basically tried to be a contrast to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and this is a critical evolution in the genre of Grimdark, providing pretty much a blueprint for morally ambiguous protagonists and complex, often nihilistic storytelling. Now, for a while, it was actually kind of difficult finding a physical copy of the Elric saga, but now they have these new hardback editions that I really love. They're a bind-up of all the Elric books, and I love the cover art. It even has a little bit of artwork inside, not as much as I was hoping for, but it's still the best way to read Elric. Now, next, I want to mention The Prince of Nothing. This is the first trilogy in the larger series called The Second Apocalypse by R. Scott Baker. Now, I'm just mentioning this one as I haven't actually read it yet, so I can't recommend it, but it would just feel wrong to not put it in a video talking about the best Grimdark books, because this one is about as bleak as it gets. Book 1, The Darkness That Comes Before, drops the reader into a world on the brink of cataclysm, and you kind of have to just figure everything out as it goes along. This is not a series that's going to hold your hand or info dump at all, and this is also not like a light high fantasy adventure. This book is bleak and unapologetically dark. I have been told there's really not much happiness in these books at all. There's definitely a lot of trigger warnings, but this series just has amazing world building. I've been told the writing is brilliant and beautiful, yet dense and deeply philosophical. It's a very slow book and thought-provoking that really challenges the reader to confront uncomfortable questions. It sounds like one you really want to take your time reading and just think about it and ponder everything. There's a really great video by Philip Chase that you should watch that basically convinced me that I need to get to this series at some point. The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch introduces us to the Venice-inspired city of Camor, where the poor and unfortunate navigate a harsh and unforgiving underworld of crime and survival, while the rich stay rich and powerful. It is the perfect setting for a group of con men like Locke and his crew. Now, I've seen people debate on whether this is considered grimdark or not, because there's a lot of humor to the series, there's a lot of light moments to it as well, but I would say it is grimdark just because of how harsh and bleak and realistic the world is. Lynch masterfully combines wit, intricate plotting, and a deep sense of camaraderie to this band of thieves amidst a backdrop of corruption and brutality. I would say these books really stand out for the clever dialogue and complex characters and a lot of plot twists. Not to mention just a really great friendship, one of my favorite friendships in fiction. And who doesn't love a charming con artist and his band of thieves? I would highly recommend the audiobooks for these ones, they're so good. The Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. This is a monumental epic in the genre, and I've seen a lot of discussion on whether it's considered grimdark or not. I'm gonna say it is. This is a series renowned for its intricate plot lines upon plot lines. Honestly, you kinda need a PhD to understand all of this. There's a vast cast of characters and a sophisticated narrative that weaves together themes of empire, conquest, and the cyclical nature of history. As we're introduced to the Malazan Empire, which is in the midst of expansion through conquest and war, the books do not shy away from depicting the brutality of war. Now, Erikson really draws on his background in anthropology and archaeology in writing these books. The world feels ancient, layered, and real. The world building is incredibly detailed, there's a lot of moral complexity here, and the sheer scope of it all is just really ambitious. And while it can definitely be overwhelming for first-time readers like myself, it's also very rewarding, and I can't wait to read more of these books. So if you're looking for an epic tale of magic, war, and gods playing with the fate of mortals, go read Malazan. Sons of Darkness by Gaurav Mohanty. That is one grimdark title if I've ever heard one. Now, this is book one in what is going to be a very epic grimdark series that I'm very excited about. I'm currently reading this one. I haven't finished it yet, but I am really loving it. This is based on the famous ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it is one of the greatest epics of all time, and I didn't really know anything about it going into this. You don't have to know anything about it going into this. The story weaves between myth, history, war, romance, and magic, and for anyone that is a fan of Joe Abercrombie, you need to read Sons of Darkness. The characters are all so compelling in their own way. It did take me a while to get into this book and to feel fully invested in the story and the characters, but once I finally did, I've been enjoying this so much. I'm excited to finish this book, and I'll definitely be putting up a review for it on the channel. I'm also going to be doing a giveaway because I have 2 copies of it. Anyways, go and read Sons of Darkness. Next up, we have my favorite grimdark series of all time, and you might see this one coming, but it is the First Law series by Joe Abercrombie. Lord Grimdark Joe Abercrombie masterfully constructs a world that's teetering on the brink of war, and it's inhabited by characters who are deeply flawed, yet so incredibly compelling. From the cynical Inquisitor Sandan Glokta to the Northman Logan Ninefingers, each character's journey is a reflection of power, survival, the elusive nature of heroism, and the struggle to try and change oneself. Abercrombie's narrative is filled with dark humor. The cynical thoughts of Glokta especially stand out as some of the funniest parts in the series. Despite being grimdark, this is one of the funniest grimdark series I've read. It just has a certain type of humor that's very cynical in nature. Now, these books are filled with complex character dynamics and a narrative that doesn't really have any distinctions between the heroes and the villains. These are characters you are truly going to love to hate. They do a lot of bad things. They're not necessarily good people by any means, but you understand why they're doing the things they do, even if their actions are pretty terrible at times. Joe Abercrombie is such a master at character work that you understand the motivations behind all the characters, and he's never made me feel so attached to horrible people before. I cared about these characters so much. Now, I always mention Logan Ninefingers and Glokta and Giselle, but I don't mention Dogman enough. I want to give a shout out to Dogman and all the other Northmen, to be honest, because they're fantastic as well. Now, as I'm mentioning the First Law series, I also want to mention the First Law standalone novels, because those are fantastic. You need to read the standalones after the First Law trilogy if you haven't yet. I highly highly recommend Best Served Cold is probably my favorite one out of all the standalones. It is one of the best standalones that I've read, and I really enjoy how Abercrombie's writing style kind of switches up with each standalone novel. That makes it feel so much more fresh. I also, of course, have to mention the Age of Madness series. This takes place in the same world as First Law. Honestly, for a while, I didn't really think Abercrombie could win me over with this new cast of characters in Age of Madness because I loved the original cast so much in the First Law trilogy. But over time, I came to really enjoy these characters. In Age of Madness, he continues to make some incredibly dynamic characters. I'm always going to love Logan and Glokta probably the most, but I mean Savine, Reich, Vic, there's so many amazing characters in Age of Madness as well. Joe Abercrombie has become an auto-buy author for me now. I haven't been disappointed by any of his books yet, and he's one of my favorite authors of all time, not to mention a big inspiration for my own writing as well. And those are some of the best grimdark fantasy books out there. Now, there's obviously going to be a lot that I haven't read yet that weren't included in this video, so make sure to leave your recommendations in the comments, but I do hope that I helped you guys find some new recommendations here. And I would like to give a special shout out to my most recent highest tier patron, Mike Baker. Man, you have been amazing. Thank you so much for the support.